Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This episode is 189, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/189. And there's actually no video for this episode. This will be the first time in a long time that I've only put an episode out in audio format. And the reason why is because I gave another one of my anti-COVID totalitarianism speeches. This one was at Paradise Shores in Holcomb, Wisconsin. And I recorded it this time. I didn't record the audio version of my first COVID speech, frankly, because I don't know, I didn't have a podium and I didn't have anywhere to put it. So there was a recording that was made of that first speech, but it's like in a private Facebook group, and I didn't want to mess around for an hour or two trying to figure that out. But I think that this speech is a lot better, and I actually think that this is one of the best speeches that I've ever given. So I wanted to share it with you guys on the podcast here, and I really think that you'll enjoy it. And then I'm going to play the speech, and I'm going to make a few comments about the things I talked about and how that all went down. And then maybe I'll just give a little thoughts on post-libertarianism, just a little bit, and just talk about strategy in a larger picture. So I'll talk about those things after the speech plays. But before we get into it, I just want to remind everyone that this show is a part of the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. We're currently doing our annual fundraiser, which is huge for the Institute and huge for this show as well. If you want to head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate, you can see all the tiers, and you actually get bonuses for donating to the Libertarian Institute, and you can write it off on your taxes too. We have a matching donor who is still going to be matching donations of $100 or more up to $15,000. So really would encourage everyone to go on over to Libertarian Institute and help us out with our annual fundraiser. We have huge things planned for the next year, and you can be a part of that. But without further delay, here is my speech at Paradise Shores in Holcomb, Wisconsin, and this was last Wednesday night. All right, so I'd like to thank Karen for coming up and speaking to us tonight. I'd also like to thank everyone for coming up and coming out to hear us speak, and especially the family with young children over there. I have two kids, the same ages, two boys, and they're the reason that I'm here tonight. So, a few months into 2 weeks to stop the spread of COVID-19, there was a gigantic demographic reversal that occurred in the United States, and almost nobody talked about it. If they did, they hid a key reason why it occurred. Since the end of slavery in the United States and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the major trend in the U.S. was for people to flock from the countryside into cities and the surrounding suburbs. But once COVID hit, the white-collar offices turned remote, and this major historical trend reversed. Why live in the city and put up with traffic, bad neighbors, high prices, and pollution when you could live in the countryside and do the same job, right? Makes total sense. Well, at least that's what the news told you. What the news didn't tell you is that conservatives and liberals alike were running from bad government policy. For instance, and you might have heard of this, you probably haven't though, United Van Lines performed an annual survey in 2020, and that's like, U-Haul. They performed an annual survey which measured where people moved to in the United States and where they moved from during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this survey found that out west, people were fleeing California for Arizona, Idaho, and North Dakota. They were fleeing places like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey for places like New Hampshire, Maine, Florida, and Texas, and Tennessee. Do you think that it's a coincidence that people were fleeing states that destroyed the Bill of Rights with aggressive COVID policies? I don't think so. Indeed, during the COVID pandemic, Americans began to realize a principle that Thomas Jefferson held in very high regard. You might have heard of him. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. If you had a good history teacher in high school, you might have heard this term. If you had a really good history teacher, you'd know its true meaning. That word is federalism. And no, federalism does not mean a belief in the supremacy of the federal government. It doesn't even necessarily mean states' rights. What I'm referring to when I say federalism is the principle that the power of government should not be centralized in one political unit. It should be spread out into states, counties, towns, and even neighborhoods. Now, everyone in this room knows what federalism is because you've lived it for the last 2 years. During COVID-19, for the first time in generations, it truly mattered if you lived in New York City or Neillsville, Wisconsin. It even mattered if you lived in Eau Claire or Holcomb. The difference might mean that you had to wear a mask everywhere except your home. It might mean that you were locked in your home. It might mean that your job was deemed to be non-essential. Remember that? It might mean that you couldn't or can't enter a bar or a store without being vaccinated. And it's going to mean far more pretty soon. Now, I grew up not too far from here in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. After 8th grade, my parents moved us to Wisconsin, where I live now, about an hour east of here. And after law school, I took an opportunity to move back as law school was in the Twin Cities. In towns like it's not incredibly common for young people to move away for school and then come back, but I did. And I assume it's not that much different here in Holcomb. That's probably the case here. So one of the big reasons that I moved back is that principle that I just told you about, the one that Thomas Jefferson held so highly, federalism. I moved back because folks in the country are more likely to realize that the government is supposed to work for them and not the other way around. That's what makes small town America different. Now you see, in this community, and many just like it, it is not the government that defines who we are. It's the common bond that we share with our neighbors. It's businesses, it's the churches, it's the VFW, and it's the Rotary Club and other organizations like that. It's the volunteers and the service organizations that make small town America what it is. This is the rugged American spirit upon which this country was built. It is knowing that we don't need the government to come rescue us because we have each other, and together we will overcome any crisis. Now, federalism says that communities with our values should not be yoked together under the same policies as places like New York, or even Milwaukee, or even Eau Claire. Federalism is the idea that locals who share local customs and values should dictate local policy. Is that such an alien concept? Holcomb, Wisconsin should have different rules than Huntington Beach, California, or even Eau Claire. And this rugged American spirit has led communities like this, it has set communities like this apart from the rest of the country, especially in the last year and a half. And for all the differences in COVID policies across the country and across the world, the COVID case and death rates are no different. Surely, if COVID restrictions worked, we'd be able to clearly identify the differences by the body count, right? Or age-adjusted mortality. People would be dying in the streets without restrictions. And with restrictions, they'd be locked in their houses, but they'd be safe, right? If we believed what everyone told us on the news. Instead, the places who did absolutely nothing about COVID, like North Dakota, Norway, and Sweden, and Florida, did much better than the places that destroyed the liberty of their citizens. Now, don't get me wrong, small-town America was not and is not untouched by COVID-19. But compared to many places in this country, coming back to small-town America is like taking a time machine. And that time machine leads right back to fall 2019. That's right, if you can find time to peel yourself away from the corporate press on the television, radio, or on social media, it's possible to forget about COVID-19. And I know I have, and I hope that you guys have been able to as well. But if only for a few minutes. Now, what exactly has allowed this to take place? Well, it's the value that federalism is supposed to protect. It's one of the values that we as Americans and Wisconsinites are supposed to hold very dearly. And what is that value? That's liberty. It's freedom. It's the right to choose for ourselves exactly what we would like to do with our bodies and our property. That's what America is all about. It's the freedom to choose, and the freedom for different individuals and communities to make different choices. And that's okay. The founders understood the vital importance of liberty and federalism. Liberty was so important to them that they risked everything to fight and win an impossible war to secure their liberty. Then, after that, they enshrined these hard-won liberties in the Constitution, which guaranteed the liberties for future generations. Furthermore, the founders understood that these rights were crucial no matter what emergency occurred. Otherwise, those who wanted more power need only create an emergency to gain that power. And make no mistake, government power necessarily comes at the expense of liberty. Now, we all know this, everyone should know this. Sickness and plagues have threatened humanity since the dawn of man. In fact, during the American Revolution, this is a famous story, the Continental Army suffered an outbreak of smallpox when they were camped at Valley Forge, and many soldiers died. So, of course, the founders were aware of plagues and disease. They had just lived through it. Still, the founders did not give the federal government the power to force every American to take a vaccine. They did not give the federal government the power to force every American to use a vaccine passport. Yet today, the criminals in Madison and Washington have stopped even pretending that they care about the Constitution as they pass measures that trample all over it. And this is something that Karen just illustrated for us. And I definitely agree 100%. The legislature doesn't matter anymore, and the courts don't matter anymore. Now, although I suspect that more federal mandates are coming, most COVID-19 measures that affect us actually come from Madison. In the last year and a half, the state of Wisconsin has locked everyone in their houses. They postponed jury trials indefinitely, which is a right guaranteed under the Constitution. Justice delayed is justice denied. They mandated the wearing of face masks. They called half of our jobs non-essential, and they waged a war on small businesses. And all the while, they allowed national chains to remain open. It's almost as if national chains buy politicians and influence. Imagine that. So in 2 weeks, Americans surrendered their most basic liberties for safety and security. And for the price of our Constitution, we received neither safety nor security. 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into months of lockdowns. And at one point, Wisconsinites actually had to tune into the TV every day in order to be told by Governor Evers if we could enjoy our most basic rights. That doesn't sound like liberty to me. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The right to peaceably assemble is also enshrined in Article 1, Section 4 of the Wisconsin Constitution. This means that the government cannot lock us in our houses or prevent us from going to work, going on vacation, or condition that right upon getting a vaccination or wearing a mask. This is clear to everyone in this room, but for some reason, it might not be clear to lawyers or judges. Furthermore, the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. That means the police or anyone acting on behalf of the state cannot stop you without first suspecting you of a crime. This emphatically means that the government cannot stop you to question you about your vaccination status, and they can't compel private businesses to do that either. This right is enshrined in Article 1, Section 11 of the Wisconsin Constitution as well. So regardless of these constitutional issues, there is one fundamental principle that underpins the entire American system of government, that all government power must come from the consent of the governed. Now this principle, you can trace it all the way back to the Magna Carta, and that happened in England a long time ago in the Middle Ages. And even when the Magna Carta was written and signed, the Magna Carta was referring to the consent of the governed being something from antiquity. So that means that this principle is thousands of years old. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, quote, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of its duty to protect the people's liberty, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." Well, ladies and gentlemen, when the government so blatantly destroys our fundamental rights, I think it's high time that we at least think about altering it. Thank you. So yes, even in spite of federalism and the quibbles, well, huge problems that I have with the actions of the state of Wisconsin in the last year and a half, small town America is still being held hostage to some degree at least by outside governments, but most of all, they're being held hostage by their own county boards, school boards, and county health departments. And I'm going to go off script a little bit here to talk about what's happening in Taylor County. So what we have essentially is unelected agencies without accountability to the public that are creating and enforcing policy. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term deep state. Has anyone heard of that term? What that term, and I think Ron Paul used it first, that term refers to all of the bureaucrats that don't come and go with every administration. So those are people in all the alphabet soup agencies, is what I call them. They are the people in the DHS, the FBI, the CIA, Department of Homeland Security, all those different alphabet soup agencies, FDA, CDC, they're the ones who aren't elected who are making and crafting policy. And they orchestrate things like this as much, if not more, than the politicians that are supposedly accountable to us. So at least in Taylor County, it's the public health department that is dictating this policy. It's the county health director. And she is the one who, for instance, is directing the school board to quarantine students after they've been exposed to someone who tested positive for COVID-19. And from what I understand, this is occurring all across the country. I understand this is also occurring in Eau Claire. There was a famous case where Judge Harless ordered a 16-year-old girl to quarantine because she was exposed to someone with COVID-19, I believe. And I know she was quarantined. But she was ordered to be quarantined, and it was done under the DHS Administrative Code. So I've heard through the grapevine that these county public health directors have a weekly meeting with the mothership in, I assume it's in Madison. So they get on with the Skype call and they talk about what their marching orders should be. And it's my understanding that these county health directors are kind of flying by the seat of their pants. They don't know what their authority is. I bet you if you ask them what their authority is, they couldn't point to a specific statute or anything like that. What they're doing is that they're looking at what other counties are doing across the state, and they are copying them. And of course, everyone is getting their marching orders from the mothership in Madison. And the mothership in Madison, I'm sure, is getting their orders from the national administrative agencies. So what they're trying to do then is they're trying to use their authority to direct law enforcement to enforce these policies, specifically in Taylor County, the policy of quarantining high school students who someone said had been exposed to a COVID positive person for more than 15 minutes. And there's a bit of an optimistic note, because what happened in Taylor County is the school board voted to stop quarantining students who had allegedly been exposed to someone who was COVID-19 positive. And the county health department sent an order to the high school, the school board, ordering them to send these kids, to have them be quarantined. And also said that the police department and sheriff's department would show up to forcibly quarantine these students if they refused to go home. Now, to the credit of Taylor County, and this earned my respect, is the police departments and the sheriff departments issued public statements saying, no way in hell we're doing that. And that's brave. That is brave, and that's the kind of bravery that we need. So again, there's a disturbing trend that's been happening that I've witnessed, where school districts are treating students differently based on their vaccination status. In some places this is explicit, and in some places this is just de facto what is happening. So it's my understanding, and again, take this with a grain of salt, it's my understanding that at least in the Taylor County School District, students who have been vaccinated can produce a negative test and they can start coming back to school. But if you're unvaccinated, it is mandatory that you have to quarantine for the designated period of time. And for high school students, I mean, can you imagine you're a senior you like to play in homecoming, or you're in band and this is your senior year and you like to play homecoming because this is your last chance to do it, but you've been exposed, according to hearsay evidence, someone said that you were with someone who tested positive for COVID-19. Oh, well, sorry, now you can't play. But if you get vaccinated, then you can take a test and produce that for us and you can play homecoming. So I can imagine that for a teenager. I'm 28 years old. I'm not too far removed from that mindset. That's everything. And what does it matter if I just get a prick in the arm? Then I can do what I want. And parents are, it's not for me to judge what another parent does with their children, but parents are saying, oh, we'll just get them vaccinated and they'll be fine. So this is concerning, and I think that years down the road, if there is something, which I believe there is, but if there is something sinister about these vaccines, I think a lot of these kids will be questioning, Mom and Dad, why? Why did you do that?
Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wishlist there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribe button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to rockfin.com, ROKFIN. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute, just a whole bunch of people, Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack, /Substack, so you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts, Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show.
Another problem is that lots of people don't know their rights, and that it's just hard. And as an attorney, I feel like I have a bit of an obligation to try to share those rights. But I think it starts with each and every one of us to look into what they are. Because I don't think that schools, government-run schools, do a very good job of instructing what rights are. But one thing that you can do to see what these administrative agencies are doing and where they're trying to get their authority from is, and everyone should write this down if you have a sheet of pen and paper, is if you go on the Wisconsin legislature website, or you can just go into Google and type Wisconsin DHS code, and the applicable chapters are 144 and 145. So there you can see what I believe is the procedure for the health department to quarantine people. And part of the problem is that people do not know about this. So the health department doesn't even have to, and my understanding is that they have to get a warrant if you refuse to quarantine. And that you get due process, which is the right to have an attorney and the right, well, first, the right to notice and an opportunity to be heard. So you should receive notice that you're going to be quarantined, and you should have a right to an attorney according to the DHS code and a hearing in court, where the state has to prove with clear and convincing evidence a number of elements that unfortunately I don't have in front of me and I don't have memorized. So to find out those elements, you should go and read the DHS code yourself. The other thing that you should read is type in Wisconsin Statutes Chapter 250 and 251 and 252. And that's where the Department of Health and Human Services gets their authority from, under Wisconsin statutes. What you should also do is support the work of attorneys who are challenging these measures, and seek out attorneys that, if you have a specific issue, to hire yourself. Another problem is that we have deep red counties in this state, and I'm going to talk about this just a little bit, but we have deep red counties in this state whose county boards and local government are made up of people that don't represent their values. And I suspect that's because a lot of people who have more traditional values are busy working in the private sector, and it's people who have more progressive mindset, are more civic minded, I suppose, and they get involved with government. But one problem that we are facing in Taylor County is that our county board is half made up of people that buy into the COVID administration, the COVID regime as I call it, and half of people who actually represent the values of their citizens. Same with the county board, I'd say it's half and half. But one of the big problems is that local officials don't know their role either, is they don't understand that they have a policy position to play. They think that whatever is, they take an oath to defend the Constitution. Part of the problem is that they take an oath to defend their understanding of what the Constitution is. But they don't understand that their duty is to say what they think, that they have a right to say what they think is constitutional and what isn't. So they need to exercise that power, because right now they think that whatever is constitutional is whatever the legislature says. And that's not right. What would be the point of that? But again, I think that things are getting so dire in the United States at this time that we can't rely on traditional forms of justice. We can't rely on the legislature because they've, I think, quite obviously been bought and paid for. They don't represent our values. We have to take action, and we have to think, I think, a little bit more radically. The stakes could not be higher, in my opinion. So vaccine passports and vaccine mandates are going to create a two-tiered society where the unvaccinated will be second-class citizens simply for making a personal medical decision. This is already happening in Australia. It's already happening in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, they're not even trying to hide it. I believe it was the health minister in New Zealand was confronted with this, where a reporter actually did their job and asked a tough question. And they said, hey, aren't you concerned a little bit that you might be creating an underclass of people who don't have legal privileges, or legal rights rather, because they're not privileges, they're rights. Aren't you concerned that you're creating a class of people who don't have rights? And she said, no, we're not concerned, but yes, that's exactly what we're doing. So that is, I hate to compare it to Nazi Germany, but I've been reading the diaries of Victor Klemperer. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. He also wrote diaries during Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. And a lot of the things he wrote about are eerily similar to what's going on. Jews losing their jobs, particularly. Jewish attorneys being disbarred. People repeating the talking points of the regime, verbatim, word for word, what they heard Hitler say and what they heard Goebbels say during his speeches. But there's other periods in history, too, that I think are analogous that we can also compare to. The Jim Crow South, for one reason. One thing we could compare it to. Another is the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II. So there are parallels during modern times and in the United States. But I think we are facing that right now, make no mistake. So these policies, the ones that I talk about, all the ones that discriminate against unvaccinated individuals, require the cooperation of state and county governments. So we have to think about those state and county governments, and we have to think about smaller governments. These policies will not stop until the unvaccinated are completely cut out from society, or until we stand up on a local level and say enough is enough. We have to defend and protect our neighbors, and we have to think about not complying on massive level. But let me stress that the COVID regime does not start and end with Joe Biden or even with the Democrats. It's the political and financial elites of the world and of Wisconsin and of this country that are driving this policy. Make no mistake. I don't know if you guys have heard about the Great Reset or Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, and all these different organizations that are talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And if you haven't heard about that, I would research those topics, because they are not keeping a secret what their agenda is. And their agenda is terrifying. And just a few years ago, anyone talking about that would be called a conspiracy nut. But we can see that it's all around us, and they openly stated what their objectives are. And their objectives are no less than the extinction of the human race. And that policy is I'm not making this up, this is what they openly say, is that it's merging humanity with machines and computers, changing fundamentally at a genetic level what it means to be human. So this agenda doesn't start or stop with the Democrats. And I think that these so-called leaders and elites in this country have us on a suicide pact. Federal spending is running rampant. You don't have to believe everything I'm saying to see that. 40% of all the dollars printed in American history were printed in the last 2 years. You can look that up, that's a fact. So the talking heads of the corporate press will tell you that inflation is rising prices. But what they don't tell you is that inflation is defined as an increase in the money supply. This is caused by printing money. Money printing means that the dollar in your pocket buys less stuff. Now, there are people in this room, you probably remember when 10 cents would buy a candy bar. It's not the fact that candy became 15 times more valuable since the 1970s and 80s. It's that the money in your pocket became less valuable. So inflation discourages savings and encourages speculation. It hurts families and small businesses, but it helps corporations and banks and big businesses because their assets are not liquid in dollars. It's in assets. So the government and the bankers will then, after they inflate the currency, they're going to be trying to paper over this inflation by printing more money and by bribing us with it, with PPE loans and this stimulus money. This will only cause more inflation. And I think people can already tell that inflation has been hitting us. I'm sure that you can feel it in your pocketbooks. So furthermore, we're also seeing supply chain issues. And I don't think it's any surprise why. I mean, well, geez, it turns out that when you lock people in their houses and pay them not to work and fire all the people who won't take the vaccine, you get supply chain issues. Who would have thought? So these problems are only just the tip of the iceberg. To everyone paying attention, I think it's clear that government has jumped off a cliff and is threatening to drag the rest of us down with it. It's kind of like the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons, where the Roadrunner leaves a coyote off the cliff and he's just floating in midair. He just hasn't looked down yet. And the second he looks down, he plummets down to the earth. I think that's the situation we're in right now, where Wile E. Coyote has not looked down yet. But right now, the government does not want us paying attention to the fact that it's jumped off a cliff. They want us fighting amongst each other as they tighten the noose around our necks. There's a concerted effort to turn COVID-19 into a partisan issue. The corporate media would have the nation believe that only Trump supporters or GOP Republicans are opposed to COVID mandates. And that's simply a lie. That's not true. I've talked to so many people who are good leftists who are suspicious of this and what's happening. And I think that we need to not alienate them. But unfortunately, it's a lie that many people believe. A lot of people think this is a left-right issue, especially people on the left, and that's just not the case. This issue is not Republican versus Democrat. This issue is the people versus the government and the elites that own the government. So localities must stand together against the state and federal governments. We must reassert local control over communities through nullification and civil disobedience. And nullification is something that I talked about and I wrote a paper on in law school, is that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution because he wrote a lot of it. They talked about what to do when the federal government and the legislatures ignore the Constitution. And their answer wasn't to vote the bums out. Their answer was that the states need to declare federal laws unconstitutional and refuse to follow them. And I think it so stands to reason that if the states can do that, then why can't the counties? And I know on paper the counties are children of the state governments. They're created by the state governments. But why would the principle be any different? If a state can declare a federal law unconstitutional, then why can't a county declare a state law unconstitutional? And I think that we need to think about these solutions, especially if we can't rely on the state legislature, and we can't rely on the federal legislature, and we can't rely on the judiciary either. So to go back to nullification, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they wrote about this. They wrote about this in, you can look this up, this is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So after the Constitution was passed, the Federalists came into power, led by John Adams, and they were afraid that a lot of more libertarian types were supporting the French Revolution. And so they were terrified. They wanted to outlaw any speech against the US government, and they wanted to outlaw any speech in support of the French Revolution. John Adams was afraid that Thomas Jefferson was going to lead a flotilla of French ships to invade the east coast of the United States. This was a few years after the Constitution was ratified. And obviously, the Federalists can't outlaw speech against the US government. Doesn't that violate the First Amendment? This was right after the Constitution was ratified. So this was passed into law. You can look this up, the Alien and Sedition Acts. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison got together and they were talking about what to do. What to do if the legislature violates the Constitution. And everybody just goes along with it. So they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which said unequivocally that the states can nullify and refuse to follow federal law that they believe is against the Constitution. So Kentucky and Virginia passed these resolutions, and unfortunately they weren't supported by the other states. Because the other states said, well, you can't do that, even though, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said that you could, and they were influential in creating the Constitution. But it was years later when those same states that said you can't do that, they tried to do it themselves. And that was during the War of 1812. Just a few years later. So I think that we need to, if you move to the modern day, the principles of nullification have been used all over the place. They've been used by the left and they've been used by the right. Most famously, they were used by the Wisconsin. And this, I think, is our state's proudest moment, is in the 1800s, the Fugitive Slave Act was made federal law across the United States. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court took a look at the Fugitive Slave Act, which said, hey, if a slave runs away from their plantation in the South and comes to any northern state, then the authorities in the northern states have a duty to arrest that slave and send him back to his plantation. Well, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin said, no, we're not doing that. That's unconstitutional. And you know what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. So the state of Wisconsin declared a federal law unconstitutional and refused to enforce it, and nothing happened. That's because the federal government, and you could go on down the line, all of these need our cooperation in order to enforce their laws. Think about this with OSHA and Joe Biden's mandate. OSHA has, I think I heard an estimate that if OSHA were to inspect every private business in the United States, it would take 160 years for them to do that. And that's if they had our cooperation. And so the recent history of nullification is that people have used it. I don't know if you've heard of sanctuary cities. The left has used this to prohibit ICE from enforcing the detainee and deportation of illegal aliens. They've declared sanctuary cities. Well, the other thing is that people on the right have been using this for their own means, which is Second Amendment sanctuaries. And I think that we should look at that. There's this wonderful organization called the 10th Amendment Center. I don't know if you've heard of the 10th Amendment. It says that 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights says that any powers not granted to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved to the states or to the people themselves. And usually the 10th Amendment has been trampled all over by the Supreme Court. However, it still remains. So I would take a look at the 10th Amendment Center because that's where a lot of these strategies come from. And the 10th Amendment Center, I'm sure you can find the website if you Google it. The 10th Amendment Center has been talking about all these principles. So I think we need to use these principles, declaring laws unconstitutional and refusing to enforce them. We need to do this at a local level. That's going to take guts. But we must reassert local control over our communities through these methods. So to do this, I think there must be zero tolerance for elected officials who are not fighting COVID mandates with every fiber of their being. If they are not doing this, they must be replaced by someone who will. And that might mean that some of the people in this room have to step up and run for these offices. Now, I truly believe that this is the struggle of our lifetimes, and I hope I'm not alone in that belief. Almost everyone I've talked to has said, I want to do something, but I have no idea where to start. Well, it starts locally, and I think it starts tonight. My challenge for all of you is to organize your resistance. I would use tonight to connect with one another, organize and hold your own events, talk to your neighbors, do your own research, and share that research with each other. Start freedom cells, protest, engage in civil disobedience. Identify members of the county board in your counties or in your localities who are enabling medical martial law in our communities and unseat them, run against them, find candidates who will run against them. This is non-negotiable. Challenge these mandates in courts. Speak to attorneys. We need more attorneys. I understand that. But it's pretty clear that if North Dakota and Florida can ignore COVID-19, then by God, so can we. We can start living our lives normally today. And I'm sure a lot of us are doing that. But we have to remember that no one is going to come and save us. We must instead save ourselves. We cannot afford to sit on the sidelines and watch the republic die. We must instead restore America from Main Street up. And with the grace of God, I think we will succeed. And we will succeed because we must. There's no other option. So I'm probably going to get choked up when I say this, but I'll end tonight with the words of Patrick Henry. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope that you guys enjoyed that speech. I just want to make a few remarks on it here. The biggest question mark I had was saying those things I did about Klaus Schwab and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I even, I went out a little bit on a limb to talk about the transhumanist agenda and the ones that they propagate. And I know I haven't talked a lot about that on this show, but I have, I'm speaking about content that I've heard on James Corbett's show and James talk about, and some of the research that I've done in that realm. And I really made like a judgment call on the fly because I had departed from my script at that point in time, and I felt like things were going really good. And I made a judgment call based on the type of people that were there to say something about it. And I think it went over well. I got a little self-conscious at that point, and I was like, you don't have to believe me on this. So it was a risk that I took, and I think that people listening to this show might give me a little bit of flack for it. That kind of leads me into the type of people that were there. So this was a smaller, more intimate event, and I was expecting, honestly, a couple hundred people to be there because that's how many people came the first time. And let me just say there's people in that crowd that would have believed a lot more than what I said, because I know for a fact that there were a lot of Q people in that crowd. And I think that me going up and saying, we can't wait around, no one's going to come and save us, Donald Trump is not going to come back like Deus Ex Machina from the clouds and make everything right and then be installed as president after a military coup and after he's expelled all the pedos from government and all that kind of stuff. But I did want to talk about that because if you've done your research and you know about these things, it's enough to get up there and to say all these things, make comparisons to Nazi Germany, and to say that this is the struggle of our lifetimes and the fight of our lives. And I'm not gonna not speak the truth as I see it. And I think that people need to know about this stuff, and I'm not going to self-censor and not say it. I'm not going to go in front of a room of liberals that I'm trying to convince and say all that stuff. But I felt the room, and that's what I honestly believe. And I think, there's more than enough research, the own words of Klaus Schwab and all these individuals who have said things like that. So I'm going to defend what I said there. Of course, I welcome your comments and concerns there. That stuff, talking about that, is not as crazy as what we're seeing all around us, talking about those things and talking about how a certain few very elite, powerful people are talking about these ideas and are talking about those things. So other than that, I think the event went really well. There was another attorney who was there. Her name is Karen Mueller, and she is with the Amos Center for Justice, AMOS Center for Justice, and she's representing people all across the state of Wisconsin, challenging mask mandates, and she's trying to get doctors I think she's trying to get hospitals to allow families to treat their loved ones who are terminal with COVID with ivermectin. And I don't know if she's trying to force the hospitals to administer it, but I think she's trying to do that. And she just was denied a review by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which basically means that one of her clients who's on their deathbed with COVID-19 is going to die because the hospital is not allowing, the Supreme Court refused to take the case on an expedited appeal, and it means he's going to die. She won at the circuit court level and got the order to prescribe ivermectin, but the appeals court took it up. It was appealed right away, and she filed to bypass on a speedy appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied in a 4-3 decision. And the 3 dissenting justices, one is really good. Justice Rebecca Bradley has been spot on point, libertarian absolutist on COVID so far, and she's wonderful. But she wrote a seething dissent, and it's just too bad because that client is probably going to die, and he might have died anyways. But if he's terminal with COVID, why not? If we own ourselves and own our bodies, then he should be able to treat himself and try whatever drug he wants. And I know it's not the pure libertarian position to want to force the hospital to give ivermectin, to administer ivermectin and zinc. It's like taking someone up in this is like the Walter Block argument, because the hospital's taken him in sick, and now he's in a position where he's so ill he can't move, and he can't be moved and they're refusing to allow him to take a certain medication. So if the solution is forcing the hospital to administer it, I think, of course, it's not the libertarian position to force the hospital to administer this medication, but I think there's other ways that it could be done. I think, you could have another physician come into the hospital who's not affiliated with it and administer that medication. So, but that leads us into this whole post-libertarianism kind of thing. And what I really, I'm not going to go on a huge grand critique or plant a flag in the ground or anything like that. I have a tremendous amount of respect for people on both sides of this issue. Most notably my colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Pete Quinones, who's kind of been the face identified the most with this. And all I'm really going to say is that, I don't know what the best strategy for liberty is. And I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that one path for liberty is the right way to go. And, maybe other people have that knowledge. I don't think that I do. I know I get on this show and I talk a lot about what my opinions are, but they're my opinions. And I think that everyone on this show has disagreed with me. Every listener with this show, I'm sure, has disagreed with me on certain things, and I think that that's healthy. But on some level, I don't comment too much on libertarian strategy because I think it's mostly just opinion. And I think you can't objectively prove that one strategy was the one that did it or not. And I will say that I don't think that it's a crucial, critical flaw of libertarianism that libertarianism failed to prevent the government's reaction to COVID-19. I don't think that's because of any flaw of libertarian thinking. I think by that logic, every single strategy or every single political position ever in the world ever failed to stop COVID-19. Every single person in this world failed to stop COVID-19. Of course, the government responds to COVID-19. So I don't know if that is... I get why people are frustrated, and I get those things. But I certainly do agree with some people who are talking the post-libertarian strategy to an extent. And I don't think that post-libertarians and libertarians necessarily disagree. I do think that a lot of things that post-libertarians advocate don't necessarily run afoul of the non-aggression principle. That's not to say that I haven't heard some things that do. And so... I don't want to have a whole conversation about this on the podcast without having someone to represent that position, especially when I'm, co-workers with Pete and I'm in touch with these folks and we have, a personal and professional relationship with a lot of people in the liberty community. And so I just thought I'd give my 2 cents. I'm not going to debunk any side or another, but ultimately what I'm trying to say is that this is the strategy I've chosen instead of just, of course, for years I've had my own show on Liberty Weekly and I've reached a great many of people, not as many as some, but it's not an insignificant number of people. And I've been devoting my time and effort and energy and emotions into this project for a long time. And I like Mark Claire, not as long as Mark, but I feel like being around for a specific period of time, people should at least hear me out and give some kind of credence to what I have to say. But that is really just to say that I'm trying to put my money where my mouth is. And I think that being on the internet, trying to do something and trying to put these ideas out there, I think that should get some credit for doing something. But even above and beyond that, I've been doing these liberty meetups where I'm trying to be active in local politics. I'm trying to have the widest and largest effect on the government that's closest to me. And I think that if I were to say anything about libertarian strategy, it would be that I'm trying to walk the walk and I'm trying to make changes where I can, as close to myself and my family as I can. And I do think that local governments can be used as a tool to defend against larger governments. If I'm going to try and get a bunch of people elected to county board, or if I'm trying to flip over the school district, then I don't see anything wrong with that. Trying to institute a local, a county board in a school district that was to nullify COVID mandates, or I don't know. There's a debate to be had about whether or not to make it illegal for companies to mandate the vaccine. I don't know if I would go that far, but just to nullify all these OSHA mandates that they do, I think is enough, because I think a lot of these private businesses are mandating it because of the law, because they think the law is legitimate for some reason. That's not to say, big Fortune 500 companies, that's the same motivation for them, but a lot of small businesses, a lot of local, regional kind of powers. I'm thinking about, maybe like Marshfield Clinic. And I don't know if Marshfield Clinic is owned by a larger healthcare provider. I'm sure they have other, things that are being held over their head. But, more regional businesses like that. There's other ones that I could think of, but more regional chains. So just thought I'd give my 2 cents. I have a lot of respect, like I said, for everyone on both sides of the issue, and I don't want anyone to, see this as my official, I don't want to start any drama. I have respect for everyone, and I don't want people to see this as my definitive take without listening to what everyone has to say and without getting them on the show to talk about it. But since this episode was my efforts at strategy, this is what I'm doing locally, I thought I would just give a few thoughts about what I think is the best strategy. And my answer is, I don't know. This is what I'm doing. I think that everyone should do what they think is best for promoting liberty. And unless you're actually bombing Iraq or something, or doing something that's like horribly antithetical to liberty, and that's not without nuance. And I'm sure, if you really want to quibble with anything I said, just send me an email. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. I have some really, really big things cooking for the show, and I don't want to announce it just yet, but a couple changes, a couple things that I think will allow me to provide even better content for you, for you guys going forward. So thanks everybody. We'll catch you next time. Peace.